The night shift at a hospital is a strange and surreal world of its own. The eerie silence of the hallways, the dim glow of emergency exit signs, and the occasional distant sound of a monitor beeping create an atmosphere that is both calming and unsettling. For Samantha Carter, a young nurse in her late 20s, the night shift was nothing new. She had been working at St. Vincent's Medical Center in a small town in upstate New York for nearly 3 years. However, one particular night would stay with her forever. It was a cold November evening, and Samantha arrived at the hospital for her 11 p.m. to 7 a.m. shift. The hospital was unusually quiet that night, with fewer patients than usual. Her unit, the orthopedic ward on the 3rd floor, had only 4 patients, all of whom were stable. She thought it would be an uneventful night. After receiving the handover from the evening shift nurse, Samantha checked her patients, made some notes, and settled into the nurse's station with a cup of coffee. The other nurse on duty, Jessica, was monitoring another section of the floor. They exchanged casual remarks about the weather and weekend plans before Jessica went to the supply room to organize some materials. That left Samantha alone at the desk. The clock struck midnight, and the hospital seemed to fall into an even deeper silence. Samantha decided to catch up on some charting, but as she typed away, she started to feel a peculiar sensation, a prickling at the back of her neck, as if someone was watching her. Brushing off the feeling as paranoia, she refocused on her work. A few minutes later, the call light for room 304 flickered on. Room 304 was occupied by Mr. Gregory, a middle-aged man recovering from knee surgery. Samantha sighed, grabbed her clipboard, and headed to the room. When she entered, Mr. Gregory was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. His eyes looked distant, almost as if he was in a trance. "Mr. Gregory, did you press the call button?" Samantha asked softly. He didn't respond at first. Then, without turning his head, he whispered, "There's someone in the corner." Samantha's stomach dropped. She instinctively glanced at the corner of the room, but it was empty. "There's no one here, Mr. Gregory. You might have been dreaming. Let me check your vitals." As she approached his bedside, he grabbed her wrist with surprising strength. His eyes locked onto hers, filled with a mix of fear and urgency. "He's watching us," he muttered. Samantha gently pulled her hand away, trying to reassure him. "It's okay, Mr. Gregory. You're safe. Let me get you some water and adjust your bed." He didn't say anything else, but his gaze remained fixed on the corner as she left the room. Back at the nurse's station, Samantha couldn't shake the unease that had settled over her. She decided to check on Jessica in the supply room. As she approached the elevator to head to the basement, she noticed the doors were slightly ajar. But the elevator car wasn't there. A low hum came from the shaft, and a faint breeze brushed past her face, carrying a strange metallic scent. She pressed the button to call the elevator, and moments later, the doors fully opened. The car was there now, but something felt off. The air inside was colder than it should have been. Shaking off her discomfort, she stepped inside and pressed the button for the basement. The ride down was unnervingly slow. The lights in the elevator flickered intermittently, casting eerie shadows on the walls. When the elevator finally reached the basement, the doors opened to a dimly lit hallway. The supply room was at the far end, and Samantha's footsteps echoed as she walked. She found Jessica organizing boxes of bandages and gloves. "Hey, everything okay?" Samantha asked, trying to sound casual. Jessica turned and gave her a puzzled look. "Yeah, why?" "I don't know. Just a weird vibe tonight," Samantha admitted. Jessica shrugged. "It's a hospital at night. It's always creepy." Samantha nodded but couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just the usual hospital creepiness. Around 3 a.m., Samantha was making her rounds when she heard a faint tapping sound. It seemed to be coming from room 307, which was unoccupied. She hesitated, debating whether to investigate or ignore it. Finally, her curiosity got the better of her. She pushed open the door to room 307 and froze. Standing by the window was a dark figure, its silhouette barely distinguishable from the shadows. It didn't move or make a sound, but Samantha could feel an intense, malevolent presence emanating from it. Her breath caught in her throat, and her instincts screamed at her to run. But before she could move, the figure slowly turned its head toward her. Though its face was obscured, she felt as if it was staring directly into her soul. Suddenly, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging her into darkness. Samantha fumbled for her flashlight, her hands trembling. When she finally turned it on, the figure was gone. The room was empty. Heart pounding, she backed out of the room and nearly collided with Jessica, who was coming to find her. "What's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost," Jessica said, half joking. Samantha didn't know how to explain what she had just experienced. "There's something wrong tonight," she whispered. "I think we should stay together for the rest of the shift." As the night dragged on, the strange occurrences continued. The sound of footsteps echoed in empty hallways. Call lights flickered on and off in vacant rooms. And every so often, Samantha thought she saw that same shadowy figure out of the corner of her eye. Around 5 a.m., the two nurses were sitting together at the station when the fire alarm suddenly went off. The piercing sound shattered the silence, and red lights flashed throughout the ward. Samantha and Jessica jumped to their feet and rushed to investigate. The alarm seemed to be coming from the same wing where room 307 was located. When they arrived, they found the hallway filled with smoke. But what was strange was that there was no smell of burning, just that same metallic scent Samantha had noticed earlier. As they moved cautiously through the haze, they heard a deep, guttural growl. It didn't sound human. Both women froze, too terrified to move. Then, out of the smoke, the shadow figure emerged. It was larger now, more defined, with glowing red eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Jessica screamed and bolted back toward the elevator, but Samantha was rooted to the spot. The figure reached out a hand, or what looked like a hand, and she felt an icy chill envelop her body. Just when she thought she was about to lose consciousness, the lights flickered back on, the smoke dissipated, and the figure vanished. By the time their shift ended, both women were visibly shaken. They reported the fire alarm and the smoke to maintenance, but no issues were found. Samantha tried to explain the shadow figure to the hospital's security team, but they chalked it up to stress and fatigue. Samantha eventually transferred to the day shift, unable to face another night in that hospital. But even now, years later, she can't forget the red eyes staring at her through the smoke, or the feeling of being watched in the dark. To this day, the staff at St. Vincent's occasionally report strange occurrences on the night shift, and room 307 remains unoccupied more often than not. Some say it's just a coincidence. Others believe it's something far more sinister. It was a cold winter night in rural Montana when 24-year-old Ryan started his shift at a 24-hour gas station. His job was simple: man the counter, restock shelves, and make sure the place stayed clean. The gas station was located off a desolate highway, with only the occasional trucker stopping by during the late hours. It was usually quiet, almost eerily so, but Ryan liked the solitude. Around 2 a.m., the station was dead quiet. Ryan was leaning on the counter, scrolling through his phone, when the automatic sliding doors opened. He looked up, expecting to see a customer, but there was no one there. The cold wind howled into the station, and Ryan shivered as he stepped out from behind the counter to check. "Hello?" he called, but the parking lot was empty. Figuring it was just a glitch with the doors, Ryan returned to the counter. Minutes later, the doors opened again. This time, he walked outside, checking around the building. Still, no one was there. He went back inside, but the feeling of being watched began to creep over him. About 20 minutes later, he heard a faint tapping noise. It was rhythmic, coming from the large glass window to the side of the counter. Ryan turned his head and froze. There, in the shadows, was a face pressed against the glass. The features were distorted, like whoever it was had their nose and mouth squished against the window. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, locked onto his. "Hey, you need to leave," Ryan shouted, grabbing the bag kept under the counter for emergencies. The figure didn't move. Instead, the tapping continued, growing louder. Ryan's heart raced as he dialed the local sheriff's office. While he was on the phone, the tapping stopped. When he looked back, the face was gone. The deputies arrived about 15 minutes later, but they didn't find anyone nearby. They assured Ryan it was probably a prank, but the unease lingered. For the rest of the shift, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him from the darkness outside. Driving for Uber at night wasn't always the easiest gig, but for Carlos Rivera, it was a way to make ends meet. The late-night hours often meant fewer riders, but higher fares a trade-off he was willing to make. Based in Denver, Colorado, Carlos had his fair share of bizarre encounters and wild stories from drunk partygoers, insomniac travelers, and even the occasional eccentric passenger. However, none of those experiences compared to what happened on a frigid December night, leaving him questioning if he'd ever work the night shift again. It was a quiet Tuesday evening, and Carlos had been on the road since 9 p.m. Business was slow as usual on a weeknight, and most of his rides were uneventful: a young couple heading home from dinner, a college student on his way back to campus, and an older woman needing a late-night grocery run. By midnight, the city streets were nearly deserted, with only a scattering of headlights illuminating the snow-dusted roads. Carlos parked his car at a gas station to grab a coffee and check his app for any incoming ride requests. As he sipped his steaming cup, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a new pickup request from someone named Elliot, located about 5 miles away in an older part of the city. The area was known for its historic buildings, narrow streets, and an unsettling reputation for being a bit eerie at night. But Carlos didn't think much of it. A ride was a ride, and he could use the fare. He accepted the request and set off toward the location. The address led him to a decrepit-looking house on a dimly lit street. The building's paint was peeling, and its windows were dark, save for a faint flicker of light from what looked like a candle. Carlos pulled up to the curb, double-checked the address, and waited. A few moments passed, and no one came out. He tapped the app to signal his arrival, hoping to nudge the rider to hurry up. Just as he was about to cancel the ride and leave, a tall, thin man emerged from the shadows. He wore an old-fashioned coat that looked like it belonged in a period drama, and his face was pale, almost ghostly. Something about him made Carlos's skin crawl, but he forced a smile as the man approached the car. "Elliot?" Carlos asked, rolling down the window slightly. The man nodded but said nothing. He opened the back door and slid in, sitting perfectly still. Carlos glanced at him through the rearview mirror, noticing that Elliot's gaze was fixed straight ahead, his hands resting unnaturally stiff on his knees. "Where to?" Carlos asked, trying to keep his tone light. Elliot didn't respond immediately. After an uncomfortable pause, he finally spoke in a low, monotone voice. "Just drive. I'll tell you where to go." Carlos hesitated but decided not to argue. It wasn't the first time a passenger had given vague instructions, though usually they were drunk or indecisive. This felt different. Elliot's instructions were bizarre and disjointed. "Turn left here," he would say, even when the road seemed to lead nowhere. "Keep going straight," he murmured as they passed darkened alleyways and abandoned buildings. Carlos's GPS showed no clear destination, and the route they were taking seemed to loop back on itself in odd ways. After about 20 minutes of aimless driving, Carlos's patience began to wear thin. "Hey man, I need an actual address," he said, glancing at Elliot in the rearview mirror. But Elliot didn't respond. Instead, he raised a finger and pointed to a narrow dirt road that branched off from the main street. "There," he said simply. Carlos's gut screamed at him to turn around and end the ride. But curiosity and the hope of getting a decent tip compelled him to keep going. He turned onto the dirt road, which was flanked by dense, snow-covered trees. The further they went, the darker and quieter it became. Even the hum of the city in the distance had faded away. After what felt like an eternity, the road opened into a clearing. In the center stood an old, crumbling church. Its steeple was partially collapsed, and the stained glass windows were shattered. The place looked abandoned, and Carlos couldn't imagine why anyone would want to come here in the middle of the night. Elliot finally spoke again. "Stop here." Carlos parked the car but kept the engine running. "Are you sure this is the place?" he asked, his voice tinged with unease. Elliot nodded and opened the door. Before stepping out, he turned to Carlos and said, "Wait for me. I won't be long." And with that, he disappeared into the darkness, heading toward the church. Carlos watched as his figure melted into the shadows, the beam of his flashlight flickering against the decaying walls. Minutes passed, then 10, then 15. Carlos's nerves were fraying. The clearing was eerily silent, the kind of silence that made his ears ring. He debated driving off but hesitated. What if Elliot was in trouble? What if he needed help? Just as Carlos reached for his phone to call the authorities, he saw movement in the distance. Elliot was returning, but something was off. His movements were jerky, almost unnatural, and he seemed to be carrying something. Elliot approached the car, and as he got closer, Carlos realized what he was holding: a small, weathered box wrapped in chains. The sight sent a chill down Carlos's spine. Elliot got back into the car, placing the box on the seat beside him. "Drive," he said, his voice even colder than before. "Where to?" Carlos asked, his throat dry. "Back the way we came," Elliot replied. Carlos put the car in reverse and started back down the dirt road. But the sense of unease only grew. He couldn't stop glancing at the box in the rearview mirror, its presence feeling almost oppressive. "What's in the box?" Carlos finally asked, unable to contain his curiosity. Elliot's eyes met his in the mirror, and for the first time, Carlos noticed how hollow and dark they seemed. "You don't want to know," Elliot said flatly. As they neared the city, strange things began to happen. The radio, which had been off, crackled to life, emitting faint whispers that Carlos couldn't understand. The temperature in the car plummeted, and a dense fog began to form outside, obscuring the road. Carlos's hands tightened on the steering wheel. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Elliot didn't answer. He simply stared out the window, clutching the box tightly. The whispers grew louder, filling the car with an unsettling cacophony. Carlos's heart pounded as the fog thickened, making it nearly impossible to see. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the fog cleared. The city lights came into view, and the whispers ceased. Carlos pulled over to the side of the road, his nerves shot. "This is as far as I go," he said firmly. "You need to get out." Elliot turned to him, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," he said, his tone eerily calm. He opened the door and stepped out, taking the box with him. Without another word, he disappeared into the night. Carlos sat in his car for a long time, trying to process what had just happened. He checked the app to see if the ride had been completed, but to his shock, there was no record of it. Elliot's name, the pickup address, and the fare were all gone, as if the ride had never existed. Shaken, Carlos drove home and tried to forget about the night. But the experience lingered in his mind, haunting his thoughts. He stopped driving for Uber shortly after, unable to shake the feeling that he had encountered something not entirely of this world. Even now, years later, Carlos avoids driving at night, and every so often he wonders about the man named Elliot and the mysterious box he carried, praying he never crosses paths with them again. Nina had been working as a night nurse at a hospital in upstate New York for several years. She had heard the stories about the older, abandoned wing of the hospital, how patients and staff alike had reported strange occurrences there. But Nina wasn't superstitious and often dismissed the tales as nonsense. One night, she was asked to retrieve some archived patient files from the old wing. She hesitated but didn't want to appear scared, so she agreed. Armed with just a flashlight, she made her way through the dimly lit corridors, her footsteps echoing on the linoleum floors. The old wing was cold and smelled of mildew. As she searched through the filing cabinets, she started hearing faint whispers. They were indistinct, like multiple voices overlapping. Nina froze, her flashlight beam shaking as she swept it across the room. No one was there. She tried to focus on the files, telling herself it was just her imagination, but the whispers grew louder. Suddenly, the sound of a loud bang echoed from down the hall, like a door slamming shut. Nina's heart raced as she grabbed the files and hurried back toward the main hospital. Just as she reached the end of the corridor, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder. She screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. Nurses from the nearby station ran to her aid, but when she told them what had happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. "You're not the first person to feel that," one of them said. "A lot of people refuse to go down there alone." Nina never retrieved files from the old wing again. The night janitor at the mall. For Louis, the night shift as a janitor at a large mall in Arizona was a decent gig. The work was straightforward, and the pay was decent. The only downside was how creepy the place felt when it was completely empty. One particular night, Louis was cleaning the food court when he noticed something strange on one of the security monitors. The camera showed a figure standing in the middle of the toy store. It was odd because the mall had been locked up hours ago, and no alarms had been triggered. Curious but cautious, Louis grabbed his flashlight and made his way to the store. The shutters were down, but when he peered through the slats, he could see faint movement inside. It looked like someone walking between the aisles. He radioed mall security, but they were on the other side of the building and would take a few minutes to get there. Louis decided to wait by the store, his flashlight trained on the shutters. Suddenly, a loud crash echoed from inside, followed by the sound of a child's laughter. Louis felt a chill run down his spine. He stepped back just as the security team arrived. They unlocked the shutters and went inside, but the store was empty. No signs of a break-in, no one hiding. Just a toppled display of dolls in the center aisle. The doll's eyes seemed to follow Louis as he left the store. After that night, Louis started hearing the laughter more frequently, always when he was alone. He eventually quit, unable to handle the unnerving atmosphere any longer. Working the graveyard shift at a gas station isn't exactly glamorous, but for Ethan Miller, it paid the bills while he worked on his college degree. The station, located on the outskirts of a small town in rural Kansas, was a quiet spot, too quiet at times. The occasional trucker or late-night traveler passing through was usually the extent of his interactions during the shift. But one night, everything changed, leaving Ethan with an experience he would never forget. It was a Friday night in early December. The weather was bitterly cold, and a light snow had started to fall, blanketing the empty roads in silence. Ethan arrived at the station at 10:45 p.m. greeting his coworker, Carla, who was finishing her shift. "Slow night?" Ethan asked as he clocked in. "The slowest," Carla replied, rolling her eyes. "Just the usual truckers and a couple of teenagers buying snacks. You should be fine." She grabbed her coat and waved goodbye. As her car disappeared into the night, Ethan settled in for what he expected to be an uneventful shift. He brewed a pot of coffee, straightened up the shelves, and played some music on his phone to pass the time. Around midnight, the first customer of the night arrived. It was an old pickup truck, its headlights cutting through the snow. The driver, a tall man wearing a hooded jacket, stepped out and approached the counter. "Just the gas," he said, sliding a $20 bill across the counter. His voice was low and gruff, and he avoided eye contact. Ethan nodded and started the pump. As the man returned to his truck, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The man's movements were stiff, almost robotic, and his face was partially obscured by the shadows of his hood. But before Ethan could dwell on it, the pump clicked, signaling that the tank was full. The man got back into his truck without another word and drove off into the snowy night. Shrugging it off, Ethan returned to his station and resumed scrolling through his phone. He told himself he was just overthinking things after all. It wasn't unusual to encounter strange people at odd hours. An hour later, Ethan noticed headlights approaching from the distance. This time, it was an old, unmarked white van. The van pulled into the lot but didn't stop by the pumps. Instead, it parked in the far corner of the lot, where the shadows from the overhead lights stretched longest. The engine idled for a few minutes before the lights switched off. Ethan waited, expecting someone to step out, but no one did. Unease crept over him. He tried to focus on his tasks, but his eyes kept darting to the van. The snow was falling harder now, and the van's windows were fogged, making it impossible to see inside. After 20 minutes of inactivity, Ethan decided to step outside and check things out. Grabbing a flashlight, he zipped up his jacket and stepped into the freezing air. As he approached the van, he knocked lightly on the driver's side window. "Hey, everything okay?" he called out, trying to keep his voice steady. There was no response. He knocked again, harder this time. Still nothing. The van was completely silent, and the doors were locked. Ethan's unease turned to fear. He backed away slowly, returning to the warmth and safety of the gas station. Back inside, Ethan decided to call the local sheriff's department. The small town only had a handful of deputies, but they were used to handling strange situations. "Sheriff's department, this is Deputy Harris," a tired voice answered. Ethan explained the situation, describing the unmarked van and its eerie stillness. "We'll send someone out to check it," Deputy Harris assured him. "Stay inside and keep the doors locked." Relieved that help was on the way, Ethan locked the front door and returned to the counter. He kept an eye on the van, which remained motionless in the corner of the lot. Minutes felt like hours as he waited for the deputy to arrive. Just as Ethan spotted the flashing lights of the deputy's cruiser in the distance, the van's engine roared to life. The headlights turned on, blinding Ethan for a moment, and the van sped out of the lot, tires skidding on the icy pavement. By the time the deputy arrived, the van was long gone. Ethan stepped outside to meet Deputy Harris, explaining what had happened. The deputy took a few notes and reassured Ethan that they would keep an eye out for the van. "Probably just someone trying to stay out of the weather," Harris said, though his tone didn't sound entirely convincing. "Call us if anything else happens." As the deputy drove off, Ethan tried to shake off the lingering fear, but the night was far from over. Around 3 a.m., the gas station's motion-activated door chimed, signaling a customer. Ethan looked up from his phone to see a man standing in the middle of the store. He hadn't heard the door open or seen anyone approach. The man was tall and thin, with a pale complexion and deep-set eyes. He wore a tattered coat and no gloves, despite the freezing weather. "Can I help you?" Ethan asked, his voice trembling slightly. The man didn't respond. Instead, he slowly walked down the snack aisle, his movements deliberate and unsettling. Ethan watched as the man picked up a bag of chips, examined it, and then placed it back on the shelf. He repeated this process with several items, never once looking at Ethan. Finally, the man approached the counter, empty-handed. He stared at Ethan for what felt like an eternity before speaking. "It's not safe here," he said in a low, gravelly voice. Ethan blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "Excuse me?" The man leaned closer, his cold breath visible in the air. "They're watching you. Be careful." Without another word, the man turned and walked out of the store, disappearing into the snowy night. Ethan rushed to the window, but there were no footprints in the freshly fallen snow. It was as if the man had vanished into thin air. At 4 a.m., the station's lights flickered and went out. The hum of the refrigerators and the coffee machine ceased, plunging the store into an oppressive silence. Ethan's heart raced as he fumbled for his flashlight. He tried the phone, but the line was dead. The backup generator should have kicked in, but it didn't. Ethan was alone in the dark, with only the howling wind outside to keep him company. As he moved through the store, checking the circuit breaker, he heard a noise. It was faint at first, a soft tapping sound coming from the glass doors at the entrance. He shone his flashlight toward the doors but saw nothing. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. When he reached the doors, he saw them handprints, dozens of them smeared across the glass, as if someone or something had been pressing against it, but there was no one outside. Ethan spent the last few hours of his shift huddled behind the counter, clutching a wrench he had found in the supply closet. The power eventually came back on, and the first rays of sunlight began to creep over the horizon. When the morning shift worker arrived, Ethan hurriedly explained everything that had happened. She looked skeptical but sympathetic, chalking it up to exhaustion and an overactive imagination. Ethan quit his job at the gas station a week later. He never found out who or what had been haunting him that night, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had been watched, stalked by something beyond human understanding. Even now, years later, he avoids gas stations at night, unable to forget the horrors of that graveyard shift. Daniel worked the graveyard shift at a distribution warehouse in Ohio. The place was massive, with rows upon rows of shelves stacked high with boxes. Most nights he worked alone, using a forklift to move pallets and organize inventory. One night, while stacking boxes, Daniel noticed something out of the corner of his eye. A shadow darted between the shelves. He assumed it was a coworker, but when he called out, no one answered. As the night went on, Daniel began to hear strange noises, faint whispers, the sound of footsteps echoing in the distance, and the occasional clang of metal. He tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the building's natural creaks and groans. Around 4 a.m., he was checking inventory on the computer when he felt a cold breath on the back of his neck. He spun around, but the warehouse was empty. Shaken, he decided to finish his shift near the front office. Before leaving, he reviewed the security footage from the night. His blood ran cold as he watched the shadow he had seen earlier. It wasn't a person, but a dark, humanoid figure that seemed to flicker in and out of existence. At one point, it stood directly behind him as he worked on the computer. Daniel handed in his resignation the next day.